in folklore, he is the Robin Hood. I mean, I grew up in Missouri, and Jesse James, he was one of these heroes to kids at school, and we played Jesse James in Outlaws. There was a reason that they were after him, and there was a reason why he was assassinated. If I try to answer, logically, usually the response I get is that I'm a naysayer. I'm a naysayer. I'm a non-believer. But the dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard has laid Jesse James in his grave.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Times Radio History Mythbusting. I'm James Hanson. Every episode we choose a moment from history, an historical figure or a piece of equipment, and I sit down with one of our experts to talk through some of the things that people get wrong, and we'll also cover a few things you may not know. Today, for the first time, we're heading to the American frontier, or more commonly known as the Wild West. And joining me today, I'm delighted to have for the first time on the channel the historian, author and musician Mark Lee Gardner. Mark, welcome to Times Radio History. You are quite the authority on the topic, so we're honoured to have you on the channel. What was it about the Wild West that fascinated you, first of all?
Well, there's so many iconic individuals that fill up the West, while it's Wyatt Earp or Jesse James or Wild Bill Hickok or Calamity Jane. These characters, so many of them are larger than life, and it just kind of draws you in their stories. And some of their stories are quite tragic, some are heroic. I mean, it just runs the whole gamut of emotions, and it's just fun to delve into.
Now, I should say, for the first time ever on Times Radio History, we're going to have a bit of musical accompaniment later on. So make sure you stick around to the end of this video, and you're very kindly going to play us some banjo, Mark. Very briefly, we should just say, how important has kind of popular culture been in perpetuating some of these myths about the Wild West in particular? I mean, we think of, Westerns in the movies, they are great, but presumably that is part of the reason some of these myths get perpetuated.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, the movies are a huge impact, and we're going to talk about some of that and with some of these questions. I mean, a perfect example of how myths get started, there's a very famous photograph of Billy the Kid. It's a tintype. It's the only known image of this American outlaw. But because it's a tintype, it's a reversed image. And so it looks like Billy the Kid is left-handed. And there was actually a movie made in the 1960s starring Paul Newman called The Left-Handed Gun. And that just perpetuated the myth even more.
Well, let's get into some of these myths about the Wild West, and your first one concerns one of the most famous fights of the period, the gunfight at the OK Corral. But did it actually happen, Mark, at the OK Corral?
No, it did not. It actually happened kind of behind the OK Corral, and it occurred in a vacant lot. It was not the OK Corral at all, but this vacant lot, just about 15 feet wide, a very small space between two buildings. But it was kind of close to the OK Corral. And I think for a lot of people, that was just a very catchy landmark. So, there was a movie called The Gunfight at the OK Corral, and it's been referred to as the gunfight at the OK Corral. It actually did not occur at the OK Corral. And Wyatt Earp, probably the main protagonist that we're familiar with, he always called it the street fight. It happened right on Fremont Street there in Tombstone, Arizona. So no, it did not occur at the OK Corral. But that sounds a lot better than the gunfight at the vacant lot.
Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, what role does Wyatt Earp have in kind of perpetuating this myth? Because sometimes, through history, some of the protagonists in a particular episode, it's almost in their interest to perpetuate a certain myth. Is that true of Wyatt Earp and the OK Corral, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, it's a little more complicated. I think with Wyatt Earp, what he was trying to perpetuate was that they were accused at the time of murdering the cowboys that they shot down. There were 3 cowboys that they killed in that gunfight. And it was so important for him to vindicate what they had done, that it was a fair fight there in that vacant lot. So, but he really never referred to it as the OK Corral. It was always to him the street fight or the Fremont Street fight.
I mean, leaving aside what you call it or where exactly it took place, as a kind of engagement, does it deserve its place in kind of folklore in the Wild West?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of this classic standoff, and you can look at it as between good and bad, the white hats and the black hats. And now a lot of historians will debate that point and say it's more gray hats. But Wyatt Earp and his brothers and Doc Holliday did represent the law, and the men that they fought were rustlers, and they were involved with other individuals who were stagecoach robbers. So you could really look at it again as this classic clash between good and bad, or good and evil. It is more complicated, but that's why it's been passed down as this kind of iconic meeting between these two groups in Tombstone, Arizona.
And we're going to come on to some myths around some other iconic figures like Billy the Kid and people like that in a moment. But how many myths are there around Wyatt Earp?
Oh well, there's all kinds of there's all kinds of myths about Wyatt Earp. A lot of the myth building that occurred around Wyatt Earp was leaving out parts of his life. He actually had a very seamy background. He was arrested for horse stealing, or in his youth. He was actually a pimp at a brothel in Illinois. There were some darker sides to his background. He abandoned one of his significant others. He was with different women. They never married. One of them in Tombstone, he abandoned, and she later committed suicide and blamed it, that Wyatt Earp had wrecked her life. So with Wyatt Earp, it's not necessarily the myths; it's kind of the rest of the story. What's not part of his background that we now know a lot about that people didn't know at the time.
Okay, well, let's leave Wyatt Earp to one side and move on to another legendary figure for your second myth, and this looks at Jesse James. Was he the kind of Robin Hood figure of the American frontier that he's sometimes made out to be?
No, he was not. The story goes is that he was like an American Robin Hood, that he took from the rich and gave to the poor. But there was no evidence he did that. He actually robbed from the rich and gave to himself and his cohorts in crime. In fact, one of the reasons they continued to rob is they spent money lavishly, and they ran out of money. And so it was time to rob another bank, or rob another train or stagecoach. So there's no evidence at all that he was spreading the wealth around. He was keeping that for himself.
So where therefore, Mark, does this kind of myth come from? Is this an example, and we see this time and time again through history, of the people around which the myth kind of evolves? It's in their interest to perpetuate something. You can see why Jesse James would want to kind of perpetuate this myth that he was a Robin Hood type figure, because it's a lot better for his reputation than just being a general bandit who's in it for his own enrichment.
Yes, that's exactly right. And see, Jesse came from the Civil War, the American Civil War. He was a former bushwhacker. The South lost. In Missouri, where Jesse operated, there was a lot of Southern sympathies. A lot of people sided with the South, and they made him to kind of represent themselves. He was their folk hero, and was still fighting in a way for the South. He really wasn't. I mean, he was mostly robbing for himself. But these people that supported him and they hid him out, they saw him as part of the common folk, the common people. So he was kind of their own folk hero, and he really didn't rob from individuals. He robbed from express companies. He robbed banks, and a lot of these people in Missouri didn't have money in the bank. It was the rich people that had money, so it didn't affect them personally. So it was easy to root for Jesse James, and he had a lot of people that were rooting for him, including people in the press. There was a very famous newspaper editor named John Newman Edwards, who was also a former Confederate soldier, and he really promoted Jesse and Frank James and their gang as these Southern heroes and very chivalrous, and kind of led to this myth building that we see with other frontier figures.
And what is it about both American society, but societies around the world, where we sometimes romanticize these outlaws and these characters who are quite nefarious characters like Jesse James? I mean, it reminds me almost of the way how in Britain, the great train robbery of the 1960s, they were almost seen as being folk heroes. Ronnie Biggs and some of the perpetrators, they were hardened criminals. But because it was seen as, well, it's a great heist, it's a great feat of daring, there was almost a kind of respect for them, and we do sometimes romanticize these outlaws through history. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't know if it's easily explained, but I always go back to something Oscar Wilde wrote. Oscar Wilde was actually in St. Joseph, Missouri, shortly after Jesse James was assassinated in 1882. And he saw the big crowd gathering around the house for the auction. They were auctioning off his property because his family was broke. And Oscar Wilde wrote in a letter, he says, "The Americans are great hero worshipers, and they always seem to take their heroes from the criminal classes, which is just so classic. I mean, he's absolutely correct. And just like you said, a lot of people look at these robberies during the daylight in banks. They saw the daring aspects of it, and they kind of ignored the personal loss. If somebody was killed, aren't these outlaws brave for doing this and going into town in broad daylight? Even in Minnesota, in the Northfield raid of 1876, the Minnesota newspapers were in awe of how this gang was able to escape and evade the posse that was after them. So there was, they just couldn't help but kind of get into this romantic aspect of what these guys were doing, even though that they were robbing and innocent people were getting hurt, and also some innocent people were getting killed because of these outlaw acts.
So if we're saying, Mark, that Jesse James is certainly not a Robin Hood type figure, how would you describe him? How would you kind of sum up his legacy?
Well, there's two aspects of his legacy. In folklore, he is the Robin Hood. I mean, I grew up in Missouri, and Jesse James, he was one of these heroes to kids at school, and we played Jesse James and Outlaws. But in reality, he had a huge impact on especially the Midwest. Missouri got the nickname the Robber State. Now, that is not a nickname you want if you want people to come and invest and buy land or whatever. So he had a negative impact, and he actually was a robber. He was a killer. You can debate, what were his motivations and what led him to this. Jesse always claimed that he was persecuted, that he wasn't allowed to settle down to a normal life, and he was forced to be a robber. On the other hand, thousands of Confederates went back to normal lives after the war. So his impact was important, but he wasn't the folk hero. That's a myth. He wasn't this, he wasn't this admirable person that you would want to emulate. There was a reason that they were after him, and there was a reason why he was assassinated.
Okay, we've done myths about Wyatt Earp, we've done myths about Jesse James. Let's come on to another iconic figure. And this is a myth around Billy the Kid, and specifically that he wasn't actually killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881. So tell us about this myth, Mark.
Yeah, so I think a lot of these myths speak to how we romanticize these Western figures. I mean, Billy the Kid is a very popular Western figure in history, and we romanticize about it. And we just don't like the way they meet their ends sometimes. So Billy the Kid was shot down by Pat Garrett in a darkened room at Fort Sumter, New Mexico on July 14th, 1881. There was a coroner's inquest. It was well documented that he was killed. But, people just weren't willing to accept that, especially later generations. People at the time believed that Billy the Kid indeed was killed. There were eyewitnesses that saw the body. But later generations, it's like, oh, there's this rumor that Billy the Kid somehow escaped. He survived, that Pat Garrett shot another man in order to collect the reward because Pat Garrett was a friend of Billy the Kid. And probably the most popular story, in 1950, there was an old man named Brushy Bill Roberts, and he claimed to be Billy the Kid. And his lawyer approached the governor of New Mexico and said, "We would like a pardon for Brushy Bill. He's old and he's tired of running." And I'm thinking, who is he running from in 1950?
And
Everybody's
how old
dead.
would he have been in 1950?
He would have been, well, he was supposedly born in 1859, so he was almost 100. He'd almost be 100 years old.
Wow.
If he was actually Billy the Kid. But he wasn't, and so they interrogated him. There was a big meeting at the governor's mansion, and there were sons of Pat Garrett and other deputies, and they asked him questions, and Brushy Bill was all mixed up. He didn't know the answers. He didn't want to admit to killing the two guards he murdered when he escaped from the Lincoln County Jail. It was very clear that he was not Billy the Kid. And we now know that Brushy Bill was an imposter. But that's been a very strong myth. And if you've ever seen the movie Young Guns 2 starts out with an old guy, Brushy Bill, claiming to be Billy the Kid. I mean, it's very popular. It's romantic. We like to think, oh yeah, we love Billy. We'd like to think that he actually survived that night at Fort Sumner, but he did not. He was killed by Pat Garrett, the sheriff.
Would you almost call it more a conspiracy theory, Mark, as opposed to a myth?
Absolutely, yeah. Conspiracy theory. People love a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
But the thing is that there's just like I said, there was an inquest. We have the document from the inquest. Pat Garrett did collect his reward money. There were eyewitnesses. Pat Garrett wrote an account that was published. One of his deputies, John Poe, he also wrote an account. I mean, there's lots of documentation that Billy the Kid was killed that night at Fort Sumner.
But it's interesting, you must come up against it quite a lot, even though, the facts, as you outline, are pretty clear, and you are an expert in this stuff. You must hear it all the time from people who come up to you and go, no, well, there were inconsistencies and it didn't add up, and,
Yeah.
there was something else happening here, and you must hear this all the time, Mark.
I do hear it all the time. And, if I try to answer, logically, usually the response I get is that I'm a naysayer. I'm a naysayer, I'm a non, it's funny because with a lot of conspiracy theorists, not all, they just don't want to hear the facts or logic. They just buy in to this conspiracy, and it just isn't worth your time to debate because they're just not going to change their minds. But on the other hand, sometimes these theories and the myths, that's what makes history fun,
Yeah.
If we're still debating it, it's still alive. If we know everything about something in the past, that history's kind of dead.
Absolutely.
So
never let the truth get in the way of a good story, as they say. I mean, just to break down some of the things you hear as part of this kind of conspiracy or myth or whatever. People say, did Garrett shoot the wrong man? What's your response to that?
No, he did not. He shot the right man.
He shot the right man. Did he fake Billy the Kid's death?
He did not fake Billy the Kid's death. No, there was plenty of eyewitnesses, yes.
And then the other one you hear sometimes is that Billy the Kid then lived under the alias John Miller, but you would say absolutely not.
No. In fact, there was more than Miller and Brushy Bill. There was even more than that could claim to be to Billy the Kid. And it's these men they're sad. They want the attention, and they did get the attention, and they kind of reveled in that. And they're just sad old men. They were not Billy the Kid.
Okay, let's move on to your Wild West myth number 4, your penultimate myth, and I love this one. Now, when a lot of people think about the Wild West, they'll imagine quick-on-the-draw duels and spinning pistols. In reality, Mark, how often did that happen?
That was a very rare occurrence. And we talked about the OK Corral. That was one instance where these men face off, and in a split second, they're pulling their guns and they're firing at each other. That was a real, quick draw type of gunfight. Another one occurred in Springfield, Missouri in 1865, I believe. It was between Wild Bill Hickok and a man named Davis Tutt. And it was at 75 yards, kind of across the square in town. But that was always seemed to me more like a duel because it wasn't like a quick draw. I mean, they took their time, they raised their weapons, and so it's just a very rare thing. I mean, I can't think of more than those two instances where there's people facing off, pulling their guns and firing at each other. Usually it was more like a murder or an assassination. Most of these guys, they didn't want to be in a situation that would be like a duel. They tried to take advantage. And, John Wesley Hardin, famous American gunfighter, he was shot in the back of the head. Jesse James, shot in the back of the head. These guys were kind of afraid of getting into a gunfight like that. They wanted to survive, and so they would do anything they could. Pat Garrett, he didn't give Billy a chance to shoot at him. As soon as he heard Billy's voice in that darkened room, he pulled his gun and fired because otherwise you're going to get killed. So, like I say, more of these gunfights are more like murders as opposed to the actual duel or gunfight.
Or even, are they often just drunken brawls?
Sometimes they're drunken brawls. A lot of times, especially with your frontier lawmen, places like Dodge City and Tombstone and Wichita, they had laws against carrying weapons. So your lawmen had to go and disarm these drunken cowboys. And sometimes in the process of disarming them, there's a scuffle and the lawman gets killed. It was very dangerous. So yeah, a lot of times it's a drunken brawl, a drunken shootout. And, Bat Masterson was in a shootout where this angry man, tried to shoot him. Well, he actually shot the girl the Bat was with and killed her instead. So, yeah, a lot of times these are drunken scuffles, brawls, lots of testosterone, but no steady-eyed, stare down in the middle of the street in the fast draw like you see in in the movies and on television.
So on the rare occasion maybe something like that did happen, and I'm kind of picturing the showdown music from The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, and it's at dusk and people are quick on the draw and they're spinning their pistols. As rare as that may be, when might that have actually happened?
Well, like I said, the only time that's close to that is the OK Corral. That's the only time that I can think of. I mean, there may be, there may be some people that really know some obscure gunfight that I'm not aware of, but the OK Corral is probably the only one that comes closest. And literally, it was a split second. I mean, they start to reach for their guns. Virgil Earp says, "Hold! I don't want that." He holds his cane up, and then Wyatt pulls his gun, and they're blasting away at each other. But they're only a few feet apart. And usually in the movies, there's quite a distance. In the street, it's not like they're real close to each other. But at the OK Corral, the antagonists were just a few feet apart when they started to pull their guns and firing their weapons at each other.
And I'm guessing you mentioned the movies there, Mark. I'm guessing Western movies are central to this myth coming about.
Yes. Yeah. I don't even know where that really started. It just becomes so iconic, though, and also on Western television shows as well. And like you said, this very thrilling music, and the tension builds, and they're looking at each other, and they're staring each other down, and I don't know where that starts, but that is central, and countless movies have those kinds of gunfights.
And just finally on this particular myth, I mean, if I had a revolver of the kind that they would have had back in the era of the Wild West, how hard and impractical would it be to do tricks with it, like you see in the movies, of spinning it around your finger or whatever? Could you have done that if you were a skilled marksman? Would that be feasible? Or actually, do the guns make that quite impractical?
For me, I think that makes it fairly impractical. I mean, there are experts who are able to do this with the weapons, but probably the most common revolver at the time, and I'm not going to get too nerdy about this, but the Colt single action Army revolver, model 1873, has a 7.5-inch barrel. It's a very heavy revolver, so spinning that around is not the easiest trick to accomplish. So, later guns that have shorter barrels, that are double actions, that are lighter, you can see them spinning around. But a fully loaded, Colt Peacemaker, as they often call it, it's a bit of a trick to be able to develop that. And while you're spinning your gun, somebody could shoot you. So maybe you don't want to do a lot of tricks.
That's a very good point. Kind of showing off before the actual showdown. Yes. It's probably not the best idea. Four brilliant myths already. Let's move on to your fifth and final myth, Mark. And this one concerns the saloon, which obviously is a massive part of the whole kind of Wild West culture. Did they only serve whiskey? No,
they served, that's the thing. Usually, again, we'll go back to the movies and televisions. Somebody's going up and he's going to have a whiskey, ordering a whiskey from the bartender. And there was, to be sure, there was a lot of whiskey consumed in America in the 19th century. But a bar had all kinds of liquor available, and, champagne, wine, sherry, brandy, and mixed drinks. There were very popular guidebooks or manuals published in the 19th century in the U.S. that were manuals for bartenders. There was one from the 1880s that had like 200 mixed drinks recipes that you could make. So, and the thing about these places, even though we might think in our minds how isolated like Dodge City is or Tombstone, well, Dodge City was on the Santa Fe Trail, and then the railroad came over the trail. So anything that was available in the east, you could get there at Dodge City. Tombstone did not have a railroad connection, but they had daily stages. There were wagon trains that brought in supplies. So if you had the money, you could literally get anything you wanted in some of these remote areas. And because they were boom towns like Tombstone, rich silver mining, there were people with money that wanted these things, and it was worthwhile to bring it in. Now, it was more expensive. Drinks were more expensive, but it was all available there in these towns. And there were plenty of people, to pony up to the bar and order a mixed drink, mint julep, whatever they wanted.
So what do you think would have been probably the most commonly drunk drink if you went into a saloon bar in the Wild West?
I think whiskey would probably be the most common. But like I said, anything you wanted was readily available. And lots of champagne was consumed. And again, various wines. but probably you see the most. But also beer. Beer might actually give whiskey a run for its money.
Yeah.
Also was very, very popular at these different saloons and bars. So I'd say your common drinks, beer and whiskey, and you might even say that still holds today as far as most popular drinks if you go into some kind of a bar somewhere.
And then let's say I was going into a Wild West bar. I have this image that I would be at one end of the bar, I'd say to the bartender, I'd like a whiskey, and they would slide the whiskey down the bar. Would that have happened?
I don't know. I've never seen that. I've never seen a reference to that. Maybe, you probably need to get a whiskey beer expert in the bar expert to tell you about that. I don't know. I've never read that in the period accounts about them sliding the drink down the bar, but possibly.
I did try it once with friends, and it ended very badly.
Oh.
So, I mean, just proceed with caution is all I would say.
Yes.
Yeah.
I can see if it's super crowded and the guy can't get all the way down there or something, maybe he would slide it down, but I don't know. But it sure looks cool.
It does look very cool. The other thing we should mention, that there also is this drink, sarsaparilla. Now for non-American viewers, Mark, just tell us a bit about sarsaparilla and how common that might have been at the time.
Yeah, it's a soda as opposed to an alcoholic drink, and it's from the sarsaparilla root. Just like, it's similar to root beer because root beer is supposedly also from a root, but sarsaparilla is a root, and it's made into a soda. And I really don't know how they make sarsaparilla or whatever. And actually, I don't know how common it was in the American West. Maybe it was common. I like sarsaparilla, but I'm not a sarsaparilla expert, sad to say.
And just finally on the saloons, I mean, do they deserve their status as kind of being so central to that Wild West culture? I mean, it's hard to watch a Western movie or watch a Western TV show without there being at least one scene set in a saloon bar. Is that deservedly so? Were they as central to those communities as they've been portrayed?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and often the saloons also had gambling rooms that were part of it. So these saloons are places where most of your movers and shakers are gathering. Wyatt Earp, even though Wyatt Earp was not really a drinker, he was a gambler and a dealer in Tombstone. And so you would often find him in there. It was the Oriental was the saloon itself. Doc Holliday, he was a heavy drinker. So you're going to find him and there were several. Usually these boomtowns had more than one. But no, they're very central because that's where people gather. That's where the miners go after work. That's where the cowboys go after the cattle drive. And that's often where some of these gunfights occur, where people get heated, they get angry, drunken brawl. So a lot of these incidents revolve around the saloons. And you have to also add in the saloons is where you have saloon girls, prostitution, and that's drawing people in as well. So that is a very central place where a lot of these things happen. Is because there's drinks available, there's women available, and men are gathering there for entertainment. And a lot of these places, had professional entertainers, whether they're banjo players or singers. They're a gathering spot, and so they deserve that status.
Mark, this has been absolutely fascinating. You have comprehensively busted 5 Wild West myths for us. Before we go, we always like to ask our guests to give us one lesser-known fact about the given topic. So have you got a lesser-known Wild West fact for us? Yes.
One of the things that I always find interesting is that, so many American Indians, so many indigenous leaders that we have photographs of. We have photographs of Geronimo, Sitting Bull, Chief Joseph, Quanah Parker. I mean, all these iconic figures, we have photos, but probably the most iconic indigenous leader was Crazy Horse in Oglala, Lakota. There is no known photograph of Crazy Horse. And there have been contenders. People have put forth possibilities, but nothing's been verified. And we know that Crazy Horse, when he surrendered in May of 1877, he surrendered because his people were starving. And they went to Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and they were led to the Red Cloud Agency where they set up their camps. So during the summer of 1877, there was a photographer at Fort Robinson. But as far as we know, Crazy Horse never went to get his photo made. In fact, there was a physician at Fort Robinson, and he tried to get Crazy Horse to go to the studio. And according to this physician, Crazy Horse said, "My friend, why would you want to shorten my life by taking from me my shadow?" We also know that Crazy Horse is a very modest man. It's just not within his character to have his portrait made. And indeed, we have no known photograph of maybe the most famous American Indian leader of all time.
But Mark, am I not right in saying that there is actually, well, at least one, maybe a few disputed photographs that are purportedly of Crazy Horse online? Would you say very much that these are just fakes? These are not real?
Well, I mean, they're real. They're just not Crazy Horse. The one that's most popular is a tintype, but most historians believe it's a much later period after 1877. And a lot of individuals with the various Plains Indians traveled with the Wild West shows that were popular under Buffalo Bill and others, and they believe this looks more like an individual who was in a Wild West show from that period. So no, there's nothing that's authentic. Again, these images are real, but we just don't believe that they depict Crazy Horse. And there's lots of evidence that Crazy Horse never actually stepped foot into a photo studio.
Well, Mark, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but we will be back very soon, busting more historical myths. And if there's anything you'd like to see us deconstruct, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget as well to like this video, subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History, on YouTube, and share it if you can as well. But before we go, Mark, would you do us the pleasure? I know you've got your trusty banjo by your side. Would you, for the first time ever on Times Radio History, add some musical accompaniment and play us out?
Yes, this banjo dates to the 1880s. And speaking of myths, I'm going to do the Ballad of Jesse James, which
perfect.
It was a myth builder as well, and you'll know why when you hear some of the words. Yeah, this song, Jesse James, helped build that myth that we were talking about. So this dates from the 1880s, and the banjo that I'm playing, it dates from the 1880s as well. If Jesse was your friend, on him you could depend. If it be true, I'm sure he always wore the belt that would equalize the wealth. He would rob the rich for the poor. It was with his brother Frank. He robbed the Gallatin Bank, carried the money from the town. It was at that very place he had a little chase, for they shot Captain Sheets to the ground. Jesse had a wife, the pride of his life. His children, they were brave. But the dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard has laid Jesse James in his grave.
Oh, superb, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us. That was an absolute privilege. Thank you.
You're welcome.